Next speaker is Michael Kelley, and Michael is the policy coordinator at BikeWalkKC. He contributes in his role to the research and advocate for active transportation policy. He also assists with BikeWalkKC's community outreach and communication efforts. Before joining BikeWalk, he worked for the Overland Park Chamber of Commerce and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, among others. So, as Joe mentioned, BikeWalkKC is one of the great community organizations in Kansas City, and so we're happy to have Michael present.
Good afternoon, everyone. All right, enthusiastic, I like that. Okay, cool. All right, so they have told me that this should work, so fingers crossed. Yes, all right, cool. Like they said, my name is Michael Kelley, and I'm the policy coordinator for BikeWalkKC. If you feel so inclined, this is our Twitter handle. And our mission is essentially to redefine our streets as places for people to build a culture of active living. So we want to essentially build a city and a region where, regardless of how you choose to get around, you should be able to get around as easily as possible, whether it be by taking the bus, whether it be by walking, or whether it be by biking. And that's largely what we focus on, especially with regard to the work that I do. So really briefly, I'm going to just give you guys a brief introduction to BikeWalkKC. I'm going to talk about what complete streets are and why they're important. And then I'm going to talk specifically about how our organization pushed for the passage of the Complete Streets Ordinance, which happened in December of last year. So really quick, so our work is, in particular in regards to what I do, is advocacy and public policy. So we are the people who are essentially known as the crazy bike people. So when it comes to anything related to bike policy, whether it be related to bike lanes on Armour or Gillum, or with regards to bike racks, we're the people who tend to make the most noise about why these changes need to happen. But we're also very in tune with what goes on with pedestrian issues, so issues related to crosswalks, improving sidewalks. We also keep a very close tab on those issues as well. We're also very much involved with congregation and community engagement, and especially, as I'll talk about a little bit more with the Complete Streets Ordinance, a big component of what will ultimately make Complete Streets successful in Kansas City is enabling communities to be able to make the argument about what aspects of Complete Streets need to be involved. So every neighborhood is going to have its own unique set of circumstances, and we want to be able to give the community the resources to say that maybe we don't want a two-way cycle track, but we do want a bike lane in our community, and that's something that is completely normal for the various neighborhoods that make up the City of Fountains. But the other part of it is education and encouragement. So we actually have a couple of our other folks here, Maggie Green and Ariana King, who you'll hear from tomorrow, who will talk more about the safe routes to school, but essentially they are the people who go out to schools from elementary up to high school and help children with things like riding bikes, maintaining bikes, helmet safety, a number of things that not only make kids want to ride bikes more, but make them safer when they go about doing that. So, what are complete streets and why are they important? So complete streets essentially help to ensure safe, reliable transportation regardless of mode. So there's several reasons why we believe this is a good policy for Kansas City to have. With regards to health, complete streets can help to encourage physical activity. Because there is an emphasis on trying to expand the modes of transportation, particularly with installing more sidewalks or installing bike lanes, there is an inherent benefit as it relates to physical activity that comes from pushing for complete streets. It can limit or lower obesity rates. Numerous studies have been done on what happens when complete streets are implemented, and it has shown that when you do it in conjunction with other activities, it can have an effect on the overall obesity rate for given neighborhoods. And finally, it prevents diseases. So if you're able to prevent people from becoming overweight or becoming obese, then you're able to prevent those other chronic diseases that come about as a result of that. Cancer, diabetes, All of those things can be prevented if people are able to interact in a physical way with the built environment. So the other part of it too is this element of equity. And this is something that isn't just BikeWalkKC's focus, but has increasingly become a focus of the active transportation community as a whole. It's not enough for us to simply say that we want complete streets. There has to be an element of discussion that discusses how we can specifically impact communities that are missing out on these benefits the most, particularly low-income communities and communities of color. So when we talk about extending access to communities of color, when we don't have a complete streets network, what tends to be the case is that we don't have, the people in lower income communities and communities of color are not able to access resources that we take for granted. So things like being able to go to the grocery store, being able to access jobs, education, even being able to access, even being able to get to their friends and family are all issues that they have to deal with because they don't have multiple modes of transportation to enable them to get from point A to point B. Additionally, it's talking about providing alternative modes of transportation. So, as Joe alluded to, there's a substantial amount of households in the city that do not have access to vehicles. So, while we would think that it's easy to drive up the street to go to a restaurant or to drive to the doctor, when we talk about complete streets, it talks about specifically trying to extend access so that people have alternative modes of transportation. And finally, it lowers pedestrian fatality rates. There was recently a report done by the National Complete Streets Coalition that looked at pedestrian fatality rates across the United States. And what they found is that while pedestrian fatality rates seem to be going up across the board, they are going up substantially in communities of color, particularly with African Americans and Native Americans. And the final part of this is with regard to safety. So obviously, if we have complete streets, it reduces injuries or fatalities because it limits the amount of negative interactions that can take place between cars and bikes. So if a bike is essentially forced to go in the same street as a car and there's no protection whatsoever, that increases the likelihood that they could end up being either sidelined or actually hit by a car. It promotes safety for all users in terms of things like bike lanes, but there's also elements such as crosswalks, audible signs for people who may be disabled to know when it's okay for them to cross the street. All of these are elements that are included when we try to think of our streets as complete streets. And finally, it encourages safer bicycle riding. So there are plenty of people who have said to me that they don't like people riding their bikes on the sidewalks. Well, good news. If you push for complete streets, then that means that in many instances you create things like the bike lanes on Armour that enable people to get off of the street, enable people to continue to walk on the street, but also allow people to move up and down a busy thoroughfare without having to worry about getting struck by a car. All of this led to us agreeing at BikeWalkKC that a complete streets ordinance had to be done for Kansas City. We like many of the concepts that it had, but it could not happen unless it was actually codified in the city's laws. And this led us to actually push for the ordinance itself. And so I'm going to talk a little more about the policy process that we went through to actually make this all come together. So started with problem identification. So the problem here, obviously, is that we have a transportation system that prioritizes cars. And by prioritizing cars over specifically pedestrians and cyclists, we are not only creating a transportation network that is unsafe, but we're creating a transportation network that does not actively adhere to all modes of transportation. So in terms of what we needed to identify with the problem, so we needed to identify the champion. So who could be someone who could get behind this and really push for this ordinance to be passed? It couldn't just be the crazy bike people. We needed to have a coalition of partners who would be willing to get behind us as well. That included city officials like Joe, but also elected officials on the city council who understood the importance of creating a built environment that supports active transportation. We needed a coalition. So in addition to people sort of at the top, we also reached out to neighborhoods because neighborhoods have to have a stake in what sorts of elements they have for complete streets that run through their neighborhoods. But there also had to be a grassroots element to it. So we had to be able to inform the public about what exactly complete streets are and how they would benefit from an ordinance being passed. The next part of it was the policy development. So we understand the problem. The problem is that we don't have a system that supports active transportation. So what are we going to do to try and fix that? We're going to write and create a complete streets policy. And so the policy aspects essentially looked at research. And with regards to this, we looked at what other cities already had ordinances like this on the books that could be replicated and add in elements that would also be good for Kansas City. So a couple of good cities that we looked at in terms of policies they had already passed were Indianapolis and Austin. We also had to have a roadmap of the policy pursuit. So we have an idea of what this policy is going to be, but how do we get the policy from this idea that we're all thinking about to something that's actually on the books for Kansas City? And the final part was connections to potential partners. So we've already identified who these other people need to be. Now we need to actually start making the connection so people not only understand the importance of this policy, but understand what specifically they can do to help make this ordinance pass. Campaigning. So who needs to be mobilized and what do they need to do? So this brings us back to the coalition building. So we've talked to the people, we've essentially explained what needs to happen. Now we actually need them to go out and do these things. So this was reaching out to places like the Ivanhoe Neighborhood Council to look for opportunities to explain to their leadership why this is something that they should get behind. It included power mapping, so identifying not only the people on the council that we needed to get this ordinance passed, but who influences the influencers. If there's someone who can speak to an element of complete streets, like how it influences economic development that we can't speak to, we need to identify that person and encourage them to go speak to their city council members about why this is important as well. Finally, messaging and channels. There are going to be people who are going to be skeptical about wanting to install just bike lanes. So it has to be a campaign to help people understand it's not just bike lanes. While bike lanes are an important component of it, there's also elements that will be improved, such as better quality sidewalks and improving public transit. And so the final push is bringing everything all together. So we have the policy, we have the coalition, we know exactly what we need to do to make it happen. So now it's actually getting it before the council and making sure that it passes. So we set up the tools, so we had advocacy campaigns, so we had opportunities for people to send messages to their city council members telling them this is something they need to do. We began to do a vote tally. We identified who on the city council is in favor of this, who is on the fence about it, and who is a definite no, and went about ensuring that all of those things would be right when the ordinance eventually came up for a vote. And finally, we followed the formal action. So when the ordinance came up for a vote before the city council, it was a matter of going there and making sure that we essentially saw this through to the end. And that led us to actually getting it passed, and we showed appreciation for everyone who shows up, essentially discussed next steps, and I'll get into this a little bit more towards the end of the presentation. And I'll skip through this. So this leads us to the ordinance. So the ordinance is ordinance number 170949. If you want to look it up, it is on the city's website right now. And like I said, it was passed in December 2017. We originally expected it to pass by very slim margins, but we ultimately had 10 co-sponsors, and the ordinance passed unanimously. So we were really happy to see that happen. And that was a community effort. So it was not just BikeWalkKC. It was also having people like Joe, like the community partners, coming out and explaining why this ordinance was important, why it needed to pass, and the benefits that it would have for Kansas City if it was. So one of the things that we were really excited about with this ordinance is that it prioritizes key areas. So one of the things that it says in the ordinance is that while this is a city-wide law, there has to be an emphasis on trying to improve the walkability and the transportation networks for communities that have negative health outcomes. And so that was something that we wanted to include in there because it is just as important to make access available for everyone as it is to make access important in areas that need it the most. So in terms of the socio-ecological system, The policy part is clear. So it's the Complete Streets Ordinance that is passed, and it's supposed to lead to the development of a multimodal network. In terms of the community part of it, we're currently in the process of identifying neighborhoods and champions and helping them to identify the elements that they want when there is a project or an opportunity to bring Complete Streets to their neck of the woods. An example that I'll give you is that we are organizing a luncheon on Friday that will have stakeholders that have a stake in the Prospect Corridor. So these are elected officials, they are neighborhoods, we have schools that are coming. All of these people are coming together because there's an opportunity to improve walkability around the Prospect Max project that is currently being proposed. So while there has been a lot of talk about trying to improve the transit, there's still a great need of discussion around what specifically needs to be done for how people are able to get to that transit. And we're hoping to use this as an opportunity to bring in Complete Streets elements. Now that we have the ordinance passed, here's some other ways that you can sort of channel all of the resources and all of that energy into something that's even better for the community. So the final part is the organizational part. So what BikeWalkKC does is we work with schools, school districts to identify activities that would be supported by this policy. So this not only includes things like the luncheon, because we will try to have people from one of the local schools, I think it's Center High School, that will be at this meeting as well. But we're also continuing to work to educate students so that when these elements are fully implemented, they will be able to understand how they work and be able to use them to their full potential. Is that? Okay, so thank you all very much. This is my contact information, and I'm going to go ahead and shut up and pass it back to Robert.